Professor Moshik Temkin, thank you for joining us for this discussion on the geopolitics of Malcolm X.
Thank you.
The conjuring up of Malcolm X brings up imagery and stories about his life, his journey, what he traveled as a person. The persona takes over much more than the thinking that we have come to document and recognize as being constitutive of what we can term some sort of geopolitics of his struggle. To what extent can we identify or see the contours of such thinking, particularly in the latter part of his life?
Right. So for me, the geopolitics of Malcolm X in particular refers to his approach to how to achieve justice for African Americans in the United States. As you know, he thought about this topic deeply, cared about it immensely, and it meant for him transitioning in particular from a kind of what he considered a civil rights framework to a human rights framework. And specifically this meant a transition from looking at the African American issue through the domestic lens of what was happening just vis-a-vis the United States, with understanding it internationally. And he thought that it was very important to spend time traveling the world, meeting with heads of state and others in order to convince them of the need to link the African American politics with the politics of anti-imperialism
and so what would
in the last year of his life.
Be the genesis, in effect, of this kind of dual dynamic? On the one hand, speaking to the world about the plight of African Americans in a human rights language, which no one else was doing at the time, particularly from the civil rights movement, but at the same time inviting a reflection on how the other struggles around the world. He was looking at the Congo, he was looking at West Africa, he was looking at the situation in Europe as well with immigrant populations already. To what extent do we see that type of language constitutive of something that, could we say, is almost unique at the time at least?
Yes, so I think one of the big differences is that Malcolm X did not conceive of African Americans in the United States as first and foremost U.S. citizens who are going to be integrated and achieve equality that way.
Right.
He saw African Americans as a distinct people who were the victims of in Western imperialism, in the same way that African peoples were or had been, and Asian peoples were or had been. And he considered African Americans to be much more in affinity with the African diaspora in other parts of the Americas or in other parts of the world than with white America as such. And this led him to think about the issue in terms of human rights, because human rights accomplishes two things. One is it conceives of African Americans as a distinctive community, a nation, right? And the second is that it makes it an international and geopolitical issue, right? That you exert pressure on the United States to change the conditions of African Americans through in the international pressure of the human rights framework of the time.
And he says in one of his speeches towards that period at the time that human rights are something that you're born with, whereas civil rights is asking Uncle Sam to, in effect, give you something. And I think that particular kind of important qualitative shift puts him more towards kind of a forward-looking dynamic. And so one reflects these days, as the United States is going through possibly what could be termed almost a new 1970s, with racial tensions coming back, with a lot of struggles that are being rediscovered by a new generation, puts him in a mode where that particular language is actually quite modern, that it goes beyond the civil rights plea, but more towards the human rights kind of self-standing language.
Right. I think that's absolutely correct. One thing that Malcolm X does that is different from other civil rights or leaders of the civil rights movement at the time is that he thinks of African Americans primarily as belonging to a group of people that are not necessarily as I said before, first and foremost U.S. citizens. And he sees the relationship between African Americans and the U.S. state as one of inherently of oppression and control. Similarly, today, we see that a lot of the topics and themes that he talked about are evergreen. They are relevant, sadly, it must be said, in that we see that these racial tensions have obviously not gone away, that race is still a major factor in US society and in politics and in the results we get. And so I think when he was pointing out how important it was to kind of understand the relationship, the importance of the relationship between white America and African Americans, we see that these issues have really not gone away.
Do we know what made the most of an impression on him during those travels? He's met quite a number of heads of states and leaders, at least. He was also extensively in Europe for a while, and he made even comments on the foreign policy of the United States in terms of the rise of China, for instance.
Yes.
What would be the features of that thinking that you'd see might have been developed further had he himself refined this thinking?
One of the things that most impressed him in the last year of his life was when he saw African pilots. He remarked on the fact that he looked into the cockpit and saw that there were pilots who were black. And he said this stunned him more than anything because it made him think in a very simple way of the kind of empowerment that decolonization was bringing, the independence of African countries, which was very inspirational to him. And became a fundamental part of his politics. So I think one of the things that most impressed him during his travels was simply to see how people of color, as we would call them today, were functioning independently of their former oppressors, as it were, and doing the kind of normal functions of state. On the other hand, one thing that also impressed him was how some of these countries that were had been victims, as it were, of imperialism, colonialism, were building their own power. And so, for example, the fact that the Chinese, in that year, 1964, announced that they had nuclear capabilities was, for Malcolm X, the most significant geopolitical event of 1964, because in his mind, having a bomb for China meant that the Chinese could deal with the Western imperialists in the only language the Western imperialists understood, which was the language of strength and power. Sort
of a geopolitical realist, you would say.
He was absolutely a geopolitical realist. That's the basis of his strategy.
And so, to finish on this, we see also today, as we were saying a minute, quite a return of these dynamics sociologically and historically and politically, these tension points, not only in the United States, but globally. There's a rise of authoritarianism, as we see in a number of places. But when it comes to the United States, now it seems as if precisely, I think the return to this kind of type of tensions of old makes his reflection above and beyond, say, the thinking that might be, say, along the lines of a Césaire or a Said or others that actually, Memi, that actually thought about these in a critiqued way. He's also linking this, and you pointed out this, very much to his activism, to his militancy, to the poignancy of that. And so today it seems that that language is also the one that we see a lot with the new movements, the Black Lives Matters and all of these actors. That makes it, would you say, somewhat of a kind of a revival of Malcolm X beyond the 90s film of Spike Lee that we saw that was also a rediscovery at the time? Can we think that the kind of issues that are playing out today makes his activism and thinking relevant to that generation?
Well, it's hard to say as of now how things will play out in American society. On the one hand, you're right to link some of the developments we've seen in the past 2 years in the United States to this kind of authoritarian backlash to democracy or liberal democracy around the world. The United States is no exception in that sense. But on the other hand, we also see I think, an impressive awakening of large parts of civil society that were perhaps too dormant during the years of the Obama presidency, which are now realizing that if they want to obtain change, real change, as Malcolm X used to call it, real, actual results, people have to take matters into their own hands. They can't expect the courts or politicians to do it for them. They have to act, and they have to get involved. They have to organize from the grassroots. In fact, one of Malcolm's most famous speeches is message to the grassroots. He believed in that fundamentally. And so my sense is that even if the link is not directly with Malcolm X, many groups now in the United States, including whether it's Black Lives Matter or their sort of affiliated groups, are understanding that the issues that Malcolm X talked about, whether the domestic condition of African Americans, and especially the links with international politics, have not really changed. In fact, we see that they're coming back, and so they might kind of pick up, in a sense, where he left off.
Well, many thanks, Professor Moshik Temkin, for helping us with this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.